one of the ways we're honoring and celebrating Black History Month is having a history maker with us here today. If you can imagine a different world, and while we still have a lot of work to do to heal the divide between the races, if you can imagine a world where many of us would not be in the same school together. If you were Black, you were in your own school. If you were white, you were in your own school. If you were Latino, Japanese, Asian, you were in a different school. And then trying to come to school together, you'd need the military and the police force to help you. And so that was reality years ago. Today we have Dr. Terrence Roberts with us. He is one of the Little Rock Nine. Many of you have taken time to learn about that, or you have learned about it in your history classes. So today he's going to share his experiences with you. As I've shared with your peers, I'm directing your teachers to remove you if you are disruptive or disrespectful without warning. So please find yourself in a place where you can be attentive. Towards the end, Dr. Roberts will answer questions, so please think about questions that you have along the way. All right, without no further ado, Dr. Terry Roberts.
Okay. Questions about some of the things you saw in the video, and we'll get to that later. It's interesting. I've watched that video many, many times, and I always find something extraordinary popping out. Today, as I listened to it, I listened carefully to Crystal's dialogue, or monologue rather, and I heard her say something about the Little Rock Nine integrated Central High School. That is actually not quite accurate. Integration implies that all people in the system are treated as peers. That was not the case. The 9 of us were forced to sign an affidavit that we would not participate in any extracurricular activities at Central High School. And that was such a determined article of faith on the part of the administrators that the experiment would not have gone forward had we not signed. So the Little Rock Nine were there to attend the class, but after class we had to vacate the premises. We could not join any sports teams, could not participate in any of the school programs, could not attend any of the assemblies, could not attend the sports games. In fact, I visited Little Rock a few years ago, and I happened to just go to a high school basketball game at Central. And somebody recognized me and called for a reporter and a photographer, and I wound up in the paper the next day. The first time former Central High student gets to attend a basketball game. You know, exactly. But I think extrapolating from that, we have to look at our entire society. We, the people, do not live in an integrated society. That would suggest that all people have the same life chances. That is not true. If you look at any of the social indicators, you will find out there are differences, profound differences, usually based on something called racial group membership. We may get to that today. But I want to take you back in time to Little Rock. I want to take you way back to the year 1941. That's my entry point. I used to say that I had the distinct misfortune of having been born in Little Rock. I've since changed that rhetoric because I don't consider it a misfortune anymore. In fact, it was probably providential because I got to learn very quickly some very vital life lessons, one of which was how to survive in a society that truly wanted to kill me. That's essential. A person asked me once, did you learn anything at Central in the chaos? I said, yes, survival 101. I know how to survive under adverse circumstances. But in 1941, December 3rd, that was my day, I didn't really know much. In fact, my main mission was to find where my next meal was coming from because the umbilical cord had been cut, and I no longer had that supply line. So I needed some sustenance. And that became my goal, one of my early attempts to maintain life in the face of harsh circumstances. And what were those harsh circumstances? I didn't know completely at the time, but I quickly figured it out. By law and by custom, I was deemed an unworthy person. I, Terry Roberts, could be dealt with in so many ways, and the person kicking me around could do so with impunity because the law said this could happen. If you were a Black person in Little Rock in 1941, your life was not worth much. I didn't like that. I didn't like any part of it. I wanted it to change, but how? I didn't have any power. I didn't have any coin of the realm. Didn't even have a driver's license. They don't license people at age 2 in Little Rock, unfortunately. Although I probably could have driven something. In any case, I grew and made it to first grade. I went to school. In fact, I didn't know much about school, but people in my neighborhood would always tell me, boy, get your education. That's the phrase I heard most of my life, my early life. Boy, get your education. Put as ungrammatically as you were hearing me say it. And yet, well-intended, because even folk who had not gained formal education knew the value thereof. So I go to first grade and I am astonished. I bump into Miss Wall, my first grade teacher, who had this approach. She said to all of us 6-year-olds gathered around her, you kids must take on executive responsibility for learning. You have to become the CEO of your own independent learning enterprise. And I took her at face value. I absorbed everything she said about that, and I developed the Terry Roberts Learning Academy in September of 1947, and that academy has been going strong without interruption since. Why is that so important? Because what you know gives you openings to explore options that other people have no access to because they don't know. Knowing is vital. What can human beings do? Choose. That's it. You can choose. You can't create anything. You can't destroy anything. You do not have those powers, but you can choose. So what do you choose? You choose from among the billions of options available in the universe. How many of those do you know? Not very many. If you're like I am, the largest thing you own is a storehouse of ignorance. I happen to know about my storehouse of ignorance, and I cherish that. Each morning when I wake up, it gives me direction because it says, Terry Roberts, your task today is to learn something new. So I'm never without a task. You know, you have some people who say, I'm bored. That's wrong. You do not have the right to say you're bored until you have sifted through every known iota in the universe and have found it wanting, at which point you might be able to say you're bored. But that begs the question of what might exist outside your ken of awareness. In any case, so learning is important. That's step one. I continued that as I marched through the elementary grades and got all the way up to junior high school. Now, something magical happened in my 13th year. Two things, really. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in the Brown case, 1954, Brown v. Board of Education, that it was, quote, no longer constitutional to discriminate. And I want you to look at those words very carefully because no longer constitutional implies that it was constitutional before. My question at the time, and still remains, how could it be that something was constitutional but is not anymore? Either it is or it isn't, especially if you listen to late Justice Scalia, who was pretty much convinced in his originalism that that had to be the case. But in fact, in 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that discrimination was constitutional because they set up the separate but equal policy that we followed, which was in place when I was born. For the first 13 years of my life, I spent under the aegis of that Plessy decision, which meant that I had to attend facilities specifically devised for black people in the so-called separate but equal, always separate, of course. And some people say separate but never equal. But you have to realize from the standpoint of the folk putting that thing together, it was equal in their eyes because it was for black people, which would never be the same as that for white people, so there was equality. In fact, when you look at the literature of the Dunbar High School, the all-black high school in Little Rock, it will say in the archives, quote, this is the finest school for Negroes in all the South. Separate but equal on that basis. In any case, this was some of the stuff that gave me problems. But I was coping with it. I was learning the rules of segregation and how to stay alive in the face of them. But then I had this moment when I was 13. I had an epiphany. I was in the Crystal Burger, local hamburger joint down in Little Rock, owned by white owners. But they had determined that they liked the revenue from black people, so they allowed us to come in to buy food to go. We couldn't sit down in the restaurant, but we could buy food to go. And I knew the routine. I'd go in and order my cheeseburger and malt and fries, stuff that I used to eat, which I thought was food. No longer am troubled by that kind of thing. Some of you may still be hooked. We might have to have a personal conference about how to get you to eat real food, but that's another question. In any case, I made my order, but then, as a 13-year-old might do, in spite of the rules of segregation, I jumped up on one of the empty stools by the counter to wait. At which point, everything in the Crystal Burger came to a sudden halt. Total silence. And everybody turned toward me. You know, interestingly enough, no one said a word. There was this absolute silence, but the nonverbal message was so palpable you could feel it in the air. I, at that point, felt something snap inside me. Something just went snap. And I canceled my order and jumped down off that stool and ran out of that place crying. I was a mess emotionally. I was really disturbed. So I'm out on the sidewalk on the way home just crying copious tears, feeling a mixture of sadness and anger and powerlessness and helplessness and wondering, is this how life is going to be? During that same time, the Little Rock School Board was determining whether or not to obey the new Supreme Court decision, the Brown v. Board of Education decision. They responded in the affirmative and began to put together a plan to desegregate schools. They chose one high school, Central, which was my neighborhood school, by the way. I lived 6 blocks away from Central High School, so it just made sense that I would be a volunteer. They sent representatives to the all-black schools, the 2 of them, one middle school, one black school. How many of you kids would want to participate? Hands went up, 150 of us. We went home, informed our parents that we had so volunteered, and parental vetoes began to be exercised all over town. You could hear them. Those numbers dwindled until finally there were 10. We were the Little Rock 10 for a brief moment. We became 9 when Jane Hill's father received a telephone call from his employer admonishing him, if you send Jane to Central tomorrow, don't bother coming back to work. Your job is history. He pulled her out, so we became the 9. By the way, he lost his job anyway. It's a sad fact, but he'd had the temerity to think he could send her, and that was enough to send his employer over the edge. At any rate, the 9 of us show up on day 1, and I'm all ready to go. Remember, I'm the executive in charge of learning, right? And I do believe that schools are important in their own right. Not that schools are the primary place for you to educate yourself, but it is a very good part of your education. So take advantage of what McKinley offers. We show up and the governor has called out the National Guard to keep us out. I'm tempted at this point to break into song. I already have my pre-assigned group. You guys ready? You know your part? I haven't told you anything. Well, he's moving away. You can still be a part of it. My name is Terry Roberts, from Little Rock I come. Oh yeah, I went down to that schoolhouse they tried to keep me from. I went down to that schoolhouse and this is what I saw. State troopers in steel helmets in the state of Arkansas. And I walked up to those troopers and said what I said. I said, please, let me in. But all their guns were pointed at the color of my skin. 1,000 National Guardsmen dressed up to fight a war. And that is why I'm late for school in the state of Arkansas. All right. Thank you. My group. You know, I was at a middle school once, and I was being introduced by the teacher, and the kids were buzzing. What is this Little Rock 9? Is that a rock group? Could have been in a different life. At any rate, the governor called out the guard to keep us out, and they were good. They did keep us out. But other forces prevailed. After about 3 weeks, we were able to return. We tried to get into school under the protection of the Little Rock police. That didn't work out, as you might well imagine. We almost got killed because some of the police joined the mob, which meant they had more firepower. Eventually, though, the U.S. Army came to take us to school. But that was not the start of anything, stopping of anything, the end of anything. That was the beginning. That was the beginning of all the stuff that happened to us. And it was not pleasant. In fact, it was so bad I wanted to quit every second of every day. I wanted to run screaming out of that place because it was bad. It hurt. It hurt. And there was seemingly no let-up. Sometimes people ask the question, as it was asked earlier in one of your classmates, how long did it take for the students to settle down and accept you? I said, what an optimistic question. My response was, of course, we're still working on it, trying to figure it out, even today in 2016. And I spent a lot of time in Little Rock. In fact, during one of my career paths, I was the desegregation consultant for the Little Rock School District. From the year 2008 to 2012, I was a desegregation consultant. I only lasted 4 years until they fired me. And I had predicted that. Anyway, I told the superintendent, you're going to find out what I'm truly doing and you're going to fire me. He said, oh no. I said, okay. Then I asked him for a complete list of all the known bigots in his system. which he denied that there were any. He laughed. He said, no, we don't have any bigots. And of course, I determined that if there had been such a list, his name would have to be the first one on it. He didn't even want to confess to that. But in any case, we got into school and we were getting beaten up every day, but we had taken a vow of nonviolence. So when you're nonviolent, you don't fight back. And in the main, we didn't fight back. We did fight back because we were young and unschooled in nonviolence, and so sometimes you just dip into violence. And I've rationalized it, of course, by saying that if you're dealing with a group of people whose language is violence, who don't seem to understand any other language except violence, then it was probably going to be, useful to learn how to speak violence. Not that I like that. I prefer not to be violent. See, I'm of the opinion that human beings never have to fight. Never, ever. So that would rule out war and guns and all that stuff. Knives, whatever you use. But one day at Central, I found myself having to fight. We were in gym class. And in gym, I caught so much hell, I tell you. I was the only black kid, and there were about 50 or 60 other kids. And all of them took shots. They would say things, well, you should have been expecting that pass. That sort of stuff. Well, one day the coach called us all together and he said, you know what, fellas, I'm sick and tired of you doing this stuff. You're sneaking up behind Roberts and you're doing these things. You're a bunch of cowards. Yeah, if you were men, if you were not cowards, you wouldn't sneak up behind him. You challenge him face to face to the mat. And he points to the wrestling mat. I go, whoa, coach, wait a minute. This is not something that he'd consulted with me about. But the line immediately shaped up. Every single kid in that class lined up to take me on. And the first guy was a guy by the name of Jerry Tully. And I knew Tully well because he was the self-assigned assailant to me. He was my personal antagonist. We were in homerooms based on alphabet, RST group. That made us close. So he took advantage of that to take out all of his anger on me. He was first in line. And I said to myself, Terry Roberts, you are just about to die. And at that point, with that thought, that realization that I was going to die, that my life was ending right then, a certain calm came over me. I've never been that calm in my life. I looked at Jerry and I said, you know what, Jerry Tully, you're so very eager to be wherever I am. I'm just about to depart this universe. In order for you to be with me, you too will have to depart the universe. And since I was the only one who understood the entire dynamic, I would by default have to become the instrument of his demise. So he came at me. He was eager. I got him in a headlock. We were about the same size. And before he knew it, he had worn a set of military dog tags that morning with a metal chain around his neck. I simply seized that chain as an instrument to restrict his air supply. And I was all in. Remember, I'm totally committed. I'm already agreed that I'm going to die, and Jerry's going to die first. He starts turning all shades of red and blue and gasping for air. And then the coach, realizing that this thing is serious, came over and said, okay, that's enough. Break it up. Then he broke up the line and shoot us all outside, which, by the way, was not a Phi Beta Kappa move on his part because something else was going to shape up, right? And something else did. By the way, the rest of that story can be found in the memoir written by one Terry Roberts called Lessons from Little Rock. I'm not going to spoil it for you. Anyway, stuff like that happened day after day. One of our group actually got kicked out of school for fighting. Minnie Jean Brown got kicked out in February of '58. She was in the cafeteria one day, had gotten her lunch, had her tray of food, was on her way to her table. Some kid pushed his chair back to impede her progress down the aisle. She couldn't go forward. And she stood there with a tray of food. She had this very serene look on her face, and I could see the little wheels turning. Do I or do I not share my lunch with this kid? She quickly decided in the affirmative, and she upended that tray of food on his head, covered him with chili. The historians called it the chili incident. However, Minnie Jean would tell you it wasn't just the chili. It was the chili, yes, but it was also the salad and the milk and the Jell-O and the roll, all of it. The next day, somebody turned a tray of food on her. And after that, Minnie Jean gave up on nonviolence and started to beat up kids. At which point, the school kicked her out. But in the wake of her expulsion, little cards were circulated all over the campus. 1 down, 8 to go. And they cranked the pressure up on the rest of us. At which point, we renewed our commitment to nonviolence and somehow made it through. It wasn't easy. By the end of that year, we were battered. Physically, psychologically, emotionally, we were a pretty shattered group of people. And yet, in spite of that crazy stuff, I was set to return. I was going back. I had 1 year to complete. I was going back to Central to be a senior in the year 58, 59. The governor, however, had other plans. Orville Faubus was the governor of Arkansas at that time. Faubus actually demands a bit of talking about because sometimes people see him as distinct and apart from the people of Arkansas. No. The people of Arkansas re-elected him 6 times. He was a 6-term governor. So he had the will of the people. He, however, wasn't all that bright. What Faubus came up with was a plan to keep the 9 of us and any other people like us out of Central High School. He determined that he would just close the school to keep the black kids out. That makes sense, right? If you're the governor, you have that power. You can close the schools, keep the black kids out. But what does it also do? It keeps out all the other kids. Well, like I said, the governor wasn't a bright individual. But what that exemplifies, and you probably know for a fact too, that in order to hold public office in this country, you do not have to have a measurable IQ. You just don't have to have that. You could be as dumb as wood and be in public office. It's unfortunate, but it's true. So, in light of the fact that the schools were not opening, rather than languish there in Little Rock wondering what next, I simply moved. I relocated from Little Rock to Los Angeles. Moved in with a relative and enrolled in LA High. Graduated, convinced my family of origin to follow me. All of us left Little Rock. We gave up our visas, never to be reinstituted. You know, basically, once you've been to Little Rock and you've gone for about 2 weeks, there's no incentive to go back anyway. So I had become a Californian. And here we are at the start of our discussion. And we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to quit talking and we're going to talk together. So your questions or comments will inform the dialogue. Now, one thing I want to say, and I don't know if it's true here at McKinley, but in some schools where I go, a lot of the kids are infected with a rare disease, and they overuse the word like. It's as if they can't help themselves. I would like for us to experiment with speaking without the help of that extraneous like. You can write them all down and use them later. Okay, who's first? Yes, here you are. Was it better in Los Angeles? In many ways, it was better in Los Angeles. In some ways, it was the same as it was in Little Rock. In fact, I'd like to have all of you do an exercise this morning to recalibrate your mental maps. Some of you may have in your mental map the U.S. with the South located in sort of a southeasterly part of this country. From here on, the South will be anything south of Canada. Okay, so once you have that in mind, that gives you real ease of operation wherever you are, because you know wherever you are indeed in the South. Now, how racism is experienced in these other places will be a matter of regional choice. Okay. Yes. What would I do differently if I went back? Great question. You know what I would do? One thing I would do is I would mandate that there be an opportunity to sit down at table with some of the kids that were beating us up. And we would have a discussion. We would move from that savagery of physical violence into the realm of cerebral exchange. And we would talk. Why were you beating me up? What motivated you to want to hit me in the mouth? What can you possibly learn by giving me such a bad time? You know, that sort of stuff. Yes. Speak a little louder. Oh, no, that was an effigy. That was simply a stuffed dummy representing all black people in the whole world, really. This is what we want to do to you people. Yes. I'm having difficulty hearing from way in the back, but if you could speak louder. Oh, his question, why was there so much racism? I suppose I could amend that question, why is there so much racism? The big why. I don't know the why, but I do know the history, and one of the things I would invite all of you to do is to create for yourself a personal historical awareness of how this thing has developed. Yes. What made a difference? Are you asking, did we make a difference? I have no idea. Actually, I can't hear us so well.
What year made the difference?
Oh, what year did it stop? We're still working on it. Oh, it's still ongoing. It's an ongoing process. It's not complete. It's not done. This is America. Oh, by the way, I don't know if you've already done this, but it would be incumbent upon you as executive in charge of your own learning to look closely at the history of this country, because my hunch is that some of you, especially those of you who haven't been paying much attention in class, have accepted what I have come to call the national narrative, which gives you a very, very polished version of who we were and how we have evolved. The truth is different from that. Okay? Yes. Good question. What gave me the faith to go forward? I don't know the whole answer to this. I've thought about this question a lot. One of the things I know for certain, though, is I was so fully aware of the fact that people who lived before me, thousands of people, had given their lives in the struggle for freedom in this country. Their blood had just soiled the earth. I could not in good conscience say no to my opportunity to build on what they started. It would have been tantamount to turning around and spitting on their graves. Could not do it. Yes. What was the worst thing that ever happened to me? That could be a good song. I don't know. I don't know. I'm hoping it already has happened. But I suppose, though, just in terms of the blood and gore, I got hit on the head one day with a combination lock so hard it almost knocked me out. That was a pretty bad day. Yes.
If you could go back in history, what would you change?
If I could go back in history, what would I change? Everything. Everything. I would change it all. Yes. Great question. Did anybody ever apologize? Yes. Hazel Bryant apologized. Hazel was on the DVD. You may not have seen her. She was very quick, but it was on day one. Elizabeth, one of our group of 9, is walking along in her sunglasses and flared skirt. Right behind her is Hazel with her mouth open as wide as she can make it, spewing out this racist invective. As an adult, Hazel has given up that way of life. She's given up the life based on the ideology of racism. She explained, however, that she grew up in a household where that ideology was taught to all of her siblings and herself. But as an adult, she said no. So she apologized, said she was sorry. What is really a problem for Hazel these days is that photo won't go away. Still is there. It's worldwide. I've seen her photo on the wall in South Africa. It's amazing. Yes. Oh, here you are. Pardon? Oh, did a police officer hit me? No, I haven't had that privilege. Not yet. Not yet. Yes. How did I feel? That's a good question. I'm tempted to just go into a James Brown moment. I feel good. No, actually felt pretty profoundly happy to have the Army on my side. You know, my default option that whole year was that if something goes wrong, I'll jump behind the officers and they will mow people down. Just take them out. Well, that could never have happened, as it turned out, because I found out years later they didn't have any bullets. No, the commanding officer had decreed no ammunition for the troops because they might be provoked to actually shoot somebody, but the threat worked. Plus they had bayonets. Now they did bayonet a few people.
Whoa.
They did that, yes. Oh, you know what? Let's do a thing like you used to play a gossip. You tell him, he tells her, and then finally I'll know. Hey, it's coming down. The message is coming down. It's making its way slowly. Oh, with Melba in the glass? What about that? What happened to Melba? She sat on that glass, for one thing. Well, you know, that sort of thing would happen all the time. We have to go. 2 more questions. We have time for 2 more questions. What's going to happen is this. We're going to take one of these questions, but then the person who has the very last question, I want you to think carefully because it is the last question, I want it to be utterly and completely profound in nature. Okay, so you're off the hook. But whoever is next, got to have a really profound question, yes. Ah, good question. Whatever happened to the other 8 people who were part of the group of Little Rock 9? There is a very detailed explanation of who they are in the appendix of the little book called Lessons from Little Rock by Terry Roberts. But in the interim, we are all members of the Little Rock 9 Foundation. There are 8 of us alive. One of our group died about 5 years ago, Jeff Thomas. But the next time you're in front of a screen, which will probably be very soon, check out Little Rock 9, www.littlerock9.com. There's a little button called Contribution. I want you to click on that and pledge all the money you'll ever have. Yes. Okay, now you are the profound question person, so stand up and let's hear the profound question. Ah, very good. Very good. I like the way you phrase that. What in my right mind gave me the thought that I should not fight? I had the privilege of learning as a very young human being that fighting is for lower animals. Humans are animals too, yes, no question about that. But as human animals, we have brains, we have the power of speech, we can negotiate, we can compromise, we can figure things out. We never ever have to fight. And by the way, fighting never ever resolves anything. You might feel some emotional release by throwing a few blows, but essentially nothing is resolved. Eventually you've got to get to the negotiation table. So why not skip the fighting and get right to the problem solving? So that's one of the things. There's a lot more. But we have to go. You have things to do. As executives in charge of your own learning, you've got a real task. And your assignment, 1 book per week from now on. Okay? Go for it. See you later.